So I want to thank everybody for coming today and thank All Things Open for having me back to this great event. Last time I was here was in person in Raleigh a couple of years ago. And now, given circumstances, we're all doing this online. So it's good to be back either way. I'm going to go through this session today. It's a 45-minute slot where we'll talk about static web apps and how they work. And I'll walk through and show you the different options that you have and really kind of show you what you can build on your own and then why you'd want them and when they might make sense for you and your applications. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to answer them towards the end of the session, please. So the way I like to start this off is think about how we're all technologists. We work with developers, project managers, business analysts, and of course our bosses who pay our bills. And as part of this, we're often asked to build a website. And when we build a website, maybe it's something like this, where we're building an app where you're creating a shopping list. Maybe you create your shopping list and somebody else will purchase it online, or maybe you're calling a grocery store through the website who will then fulfill your shopping list and then send the groceries to your house. The cool part about this is we get to build great things for the web all the time. Now, when we build these great things, we think, geez, it's just our code. We want to take our code, and that's the fun part. We want to build it and work with it. So that's the easy piece of our application. Maybe not so easy, but the fun part. But then how do we deploy this and get this up on a website? Well, we want to work with it with GitHub because that's where our source control is, or Bitbucket, or wherever our source control lives. That's not so hard either. So we're like, okay, it's not just writing code, it's also managing our source control. Well, if we're really going to do this, we want to make sure we've got some kind of CI/CD, which stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. That basically means that every time we make changes, we want to be able to rebuild those changes, possibly run tests, and then deploy those changes through our source control and then up to our favorite cloud, Azure, Amazon, Google, whatever. Okay, well, we're storing the data somewhere, right? So we have to have some kind of data access through an API. Do we build that with like Node Express or Fastify or ASP.NET or PHP or Java or serverless functions and Python? We have to figure out how to build these APIs. Well, if we're deploying those APIs and the code separately, which often we do because they're two different environments, now we have to route requests between our website and our APIs. And some of you are thinking already, oh man, this has got complicated because now we have cores to deal with, those cross-origin requests, because we've got an API in one server, and then we've got our app of the other, and we want to make sure that we can make those requests appropriately. So you can set up a reverse proxy, which all the cloud providers provide, or maybe just set up cores. Well, we of course want SSL, because once you go to the web, you've got to make sure this day and age that you're secure. So you want SSL set up with certificates, and you also want to have a custom domain, because you don't want to just have some wacky name that comes out of the box default. You want to have something like shopathome.dev. Well, talking about security, we want to make sure we can have authentication. This means that I know you are who you say you are. It just means that you know that if I log in as John Papa, that's who the person is. So we want authentication in our app. And of course, authorization. So we want kind of roles in our application. So just because you know who I am doesn't mean I can do everything. Maybe when I'm logged in as me, I can only look at lists or create lists, but maybe there's like a super user role in the application where I can also get like discounts at some grocery stores. So security is a big piece. And if we really want this to scale, we want this to be available everywhere that all of our customers are. So now we're looking at global scale around the world, basically putting it the CDN on the edge. So, Africa, Asia, Europe, United States, anywhere around the world, and maybe multiple points in those different regions. Oh boy, take a deep breath. We started this off with, you're all out there building websites. We write code. We want to deploy it. And the reality is when you work for a company and you need to deploy all these things and make sure all this stuff is in place in the architecture, all the major cloud providers have all these little pieces that will plug in, or you can even pick different pieces from different cloud providers. But the real trick is in knowing how to connect them all and get them up and running in an efficient way and an easy way. Because you just wanted to build a web app. Now, the choices don't stop there. The next step is we live in a world where you can write things with Angular, or maybe you can write them with React, or with Svelte, or with Vue, or with any number of these web frameworks that are out there today. They're all good choices. And it shouldn't matter which one of these we pick when we build these websites. So when we build these, the one thing they all have in common, all those different web frameworks, is that the web has changed today, where we used to have these script tags. You throw a script tag on a page and everything just works. But now we have something called a build process. Often we run npm run build. And what the build does is it bundles all of our stuff up. It gets rid of dead code. It makes it smaller with minification. Does a lot of cool things. Maybe even targets a certain browser with a specific version of JavaScript. So all of these will run npm run build, and then they'll churn along. We need something to run this. And when it's done, we get three things that we know and love: HTML, CSS, and of course, JavaScript. So we get our assets that we have to deploy, because in the end, that's really all we want to deploy to our site so we can light them up. So today, we're going to look at Azure Static Web Apps and how it will help handle taking all those choices for us and putting it together. So you don't have to worry about, am I using Vue, Svelte, React? Am I using a different web framework? How do I run npm run build? How do I get CI/CD? How do I get SSL certificates? How do I get authentication and authorization? How do I put all this stuff together without losing my hair, right? And there's lots of products out there that'll do that. And that's what's happening today. The cloud providers, Azure and Amazon and Google and Netlify and Versal and all these other ones, they're creating these services like Azure Static Web Apps that will try to put these together for you. And this is obviously built on top of Azure. So today, my name is John Papa, and I'm going to show you how you can deploy your static web app with your favorite framework in minutes. So let's take a look at what we're going to be able to do, and then I'll walk you through the different ways it works. We're going to build and host a static web app. Well, what's a static web app? Static web apps basically mean all the pages are static assets. Are they really? Well, they are, because the HTML, while it does change, is using our web frameworks. Remember, when we run npm run build, we're getting HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So our static content can live out on a CDN or some storage provider, so we can access those. These are our hosted web assets. We're also going to see how we can put together authentication and authorization. You know who you say you are, and we know what roles that you can provide. We'll take a look at how we can use serverless functions to basically call APIs using Azure Functions. These are optional in the process, but I find that it's really helpful to be able to have an API that you can host up there as well. Because the great thing about static web apps, or this entire model, is that you're running all your code in a storage service effectively. So it's right at the edge of your CDN, and your APIs can be hosted serverless. So effectively you have no servers to manage. And then we'll use GitHub Actions to manage our CI/CD process. We'll see how that works. And all this comes out of the box with what we're going to do. So let's look at a picture of how this works for you. You have a repo, and in your repo in GitHub, you've got some kind of application. Let's say it's built with Svelte or Vue. So we take that application, and it might be in a folder called app. And we've also got a folder called API. We could call these whatever we want, by the way. API is where our serverless functions might live. We're going to push those up or make a pull request into GitHub, which will then fire off a GitHub action in a file called a workflow file. This workflow file will run and effectively in the background use containers to npm install, do our npm run build, and any other commands that we might customize. And then when it's done, it'll deploy the built assets up to the cloud. That's where our static content comes from, and our Azure functions if we happen to have APIs, which again are optional. And collectively, those two pieces are what we know as static web apps. So then Azure makes these globally available to users around the world for you. All you do is write your code, you push, and then everybody gets to use it, which is really what we were trying to get to from the beginning. So that's a lot of pieces about this. I find this is much easier to talk about when we show it in action. So let's start off here with a demo. We're going to talk about and show step by step how we publish an application to an Azure Static Web App. And you can do this too. I'm going to do this with a live GitHub repo. And everything you see today, I will give you links at the end where you can try everything yourself. So don't worry about copying down links yet. I'll get you all of that at the end. First, we're going to start by looking at the application. What is the app and what are we trying to build? So we'll look at the final solution, and then we'll go back and we'll look at how we start with the app and deploy it. Then we'll go build the API, deploy it, and then we'll look at how authentication and authorization work. But let's start where all of us start, and that's with GitHub and our code. So we're going to come back now, and we're going to go out to the web, and I'm going to go find the final solution. We'll zoom in a little bit. So here is a website where I'm hosting an Azure Static Web App now. It's called Shop at Home. And it's at shopathome.dev. So you can go there if you'd like. Once you go there, you can see I can refresh, and it's right on this page. Notice that I'm unauthorized to get into my site. We're going to build this application such that once we can get in to the application, I can show you how I can log in with Twitter. We'll authenticate. It now knows who I am. You'll see in the bottom, it knows I am John_Papa on Twitter. Now, if I click on list, it'll go out, it'll fire up my functions, and it'll get my data. And here's the list that I created previously. So here's my data for it. And I can also log back out when I'm ready. This is what we're going to build, and I'll show you how all these pieces work. But to start, let's go back to the home page. Notice here, this says a button that's code in GitHub. We're going to go create our own version of this, and we'll set it up. So first, you can see here, we've got a main repo, which will be renamed to main later. Currently, it's master. And there's a button over here called Use This Template. I'm going to zoom in on that. If you're not familiar with this in GitHub, it's really cool. So I like to hand out tips. And one of the tips I have is you can set up a repository to be a template repository. You simply have to be the owner, go into settings, and check a box saying, use it as a template. What does this mean? It gives this green button here so that you can all go and press this button, and it will create a copy of my repo for you, but in your GitHub account. It's different than a fork because a fork will give you all of my GitHub history. The template just gives you the most recent code, which in this case is all I really want. So I'm going to click on Use This Template, and then I'm going to go over to my repo. I'm going to call this ATO 2020 because that stands for All Things Open. And I'll make it public. And we'll just put that as a description. It's a bad description. I'm not going to include all branches. We're just going to use master in this case, and I'll create the repository. So once I do that, everything comes over, and it'll take a moment to generate my repo. Now, one of the things that's in this repository is there's already a GitHub workflow. So I'm going to go and delete this because we don't want to use what was already in that running site. So we're going to reset effectively. And I'm going to commit right to master, which is probably not a great idea, but hey, we did it. So once you do this, or once I do this, now I've got my basic repository set up. Let's look at what we have. We've got an Angular app, a React app, Svelte, and Vue. Why would I have all four of these in the same repo? Well, this is called a mono repo. Basically, it means that it's one repo that holds multiple applications. And the reason I did this is because now you can go take this afterwards. And if you use Angular, React, Svelte, or Vue, any of those four, which are four very popular web frameworks, you can try exactly what I'm doing. There's also an API folder, which is where I put my Azure functions. So to start, I'm going to open up this button here. And there's three ways that I can clone this repo: HTTPS, SSH, or I'm going to use the newest way, the GitHub CLI. And I copy this. It's a new CLI called GH. And then I'm going to run over to GitHub, VS Code. I'll maximize my terminal. And then inside this folder, I'm going to run GH repo clone and then tell it which repo I want. So now it's cloning my repo and it's all there. Now I'm going to walk into that folder and I'm going to refresh VS Code on that folder. So now the folder structure in here matches what we saw up on GitHub. Make this full screen. Now let's say we want to pick the Vue application. Why not? So here we picked the View app. This is my application Liz. There's my source code. One of the things you'll notice when we run this application, if I flip back to the browser, is that the main application that I'm running up here is in orange for the color of Svelte, and you'll see the Svelte icon up here. When we run our application, it will be green for View with the green View icon, just so we can see a difference. So in this app, now we want to make sure we can take this app and push it up to GitHub and then deploy it to Azure. Right now, we've already got two of those three pieces. We've got our code, we've got GitHub. Our next step is to push it up to Azure. So there's an extension, which you can go click on these little Tetris boxes in the far left. That's the extension pane. And if we look for static web apps, what we'll find is an Azure Static Web App extension right here. Now mine's already installed. If it wasn't for you, you could click on install. Once we have this, we can then use this extension to deploy our View app. So one way to get into there is hit F1, and then we can type in here static web app and look for create static web app. That's the first menu item. I'll select that. You have to give it a name of some kind. So we'll call this one ATO 2020. And then we have to choose which branch we want to deploy. We only have one. It's the master in this particular case. Now it's asking me, where is your code? So normally, if you're not using a monorepo, your code is probably in / the root. But mine happens to be a monorepo, so I can tell it it's in the View app folder. Now don't worry if you select these incorrectly, because you can change these later too. Now it may not look like I actually selected it. I did, and at the top it went from step 3 to 4. Now it's asking, where are my functions? Well, let's give it the incorrect name just for now. We're going to tell it it's in the root, because we'll do the functions later. This is to show you that if I incorrectly tell it the functions, we'll be able to fix this. The next step is telling us probably the hardest question you're going to get asked, because knowing where your code is easy. This question says, where is the built code going to live for your View application? So when View runs npm run build, where is that code stored? So in this particular case, we have to know where it's going to put it. Now, this kind of depends for your application. So one way to find this out, and I'm going to cancel all those steps, is to come back into the terminal. If I run npm install first, because I'm going to run it locally. So we just go into the View folder, npm run install. We get all our assets, then we're going to run npm run build locally, so I can show you exactly where View puts its built assets. The reason this is important is that Vue, React, Angular, and Svelte, and many other web frameworks all put them in a different folder. So this is the one thing that's a little different between all these different tools. For example, Svelte puts it in a folder called public. And then Angular puts it in a folder called dist with the name of the application. So the way you can verify this for sure is by running npm run build. And I'll do that right now. And we should see a folder appear over here. I believe it's called dist for the Vue application. So once it's done, it'll pop it into that folder, and then we'll know what to type in when we go through that wizard once again. Now, if you're wondering how I know what npm run build is here, if I go into package.json for Vue, you'll see a script right there, which is the npm run scripts. So I'm just running that particular script that's right there. Oops. And we have a mistake in the code, so I'm going to fix that. Gotta love live code fixes. We will do a quick lint. Looks like I've got an extra linting error, and it won't build without it. Cool. Now we'll run npm run build. Gotta love live demos. All right, once it builds it, you notice I put everything under dist right here. And you can see a new folder called dist over here on this side. So there's our folder for the dist application. Now I'm going to delete this routes.json folder because we're going to look at that one a little bit later. That's one that I put in there, but I want to show you what happens without that. So now that we have it, we're going to go back into F1. We'll create the Azure Static Web App. We'll call it ATO 2020 again. Select master as our branch. We're going to select View app as our folder for our code, / for our API, which we know is incorrect. And now we're not going to use build, we're going to use dist. as the folder. This is relative to where the View app is. And finally, what region do I want to put these in? So we could say put it in the central US, for example. So now on the bottom right, we're seeing that it's going through the motions of figuring out how do I tell Azure to register these different resources that now we're going to be able to say we've got the code here, we're going to push to GitHub, and then connect it up to Azure. And once it's ready, this will give me a message saying that everything is good to go. Now, if we go over here and look at the Git changes in the meantime, we've got a couple of those changes. Looks like those are the linting changes. So I'm just going to put in there linting changes that we had in our application. Made it work for ATO 2020. And I'll commit those locally. We're not going to push quite yet. So if you look at the bottom left, you'll see that I've got a up arrow with 1. That means that I've got one push, one commit locally that I could push to synchronize up with GitHub once it's ready. Now, something I'd like to show you is over here while it's getting ready, there's an Azure button. If I click on that, you'll see that I've got functions and a bunch of other things here. The one we're looking for is the Static Web Apps preview. That is the extension that we've been using. And in here, as I open it up, once it's ready, you'll see ATO 2020. You can see in the bottom right, it now shows it's ready. And then inside of there, we can open it. And if we'd like to, we could go and right click and open in the portal, which we'll do in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to push up the changes we just made for the linting so everything builds. So I'm going to click the button in the bottom left. It's going to synchronize those changes. And once it's done, that'll disappear. And now let's go open in the portal. Oops, hit refresh. Let's hit open in portal. And the portal is the Azure portal. So it's going to open up my Azure portal page right to this particular resource. And up here it says, thank you for using Azure Static Web App. We haven't received your content for your site yet. That's because it's still building. But when it's ready, it's going to be at this URL, Orange Meadow, with some numbers and letters after it. We can also go look at the workflow file that's over in GitHub. Let's go click at that. So here's the workflow file that got created for us. This workflow file is how the CI/CD works. So in this case, we've got our code, and the code is running the workflow on master branch. And then if you scroll down, you'll see these comments on lines 28 through 33. Right between those comments are the 3 settings that we set when we entered in the wizard options in VS Code. Where's your app? View app. Where's your API? At the root, which it's not, remember. And then the artifact location, that's where do you put your code when you run npm run build. In this case, Vue puts it in a dist folder. So all of that is our workflow. And we can change this because it becomes part of our code. Now, if we want to see we'll close this window. If we want to see the GitHub action runs, we can see under here deployment history. We click on that. It's going to show us all the runs for that particular workflow file. The first 2 failed, which we knew were going to happen because we had that linting issue. But now that we pushed up the changes, you'll see that we've got this yellow circle, which means it's running. So if we click on that, we can now see the job is queued up. The workflow file can also be viewed here. There's our workflow file. We can also click on the left where it says build and deploy. That's what it's doing right now. And ran through, and it looks like we had another error. We did. So now we can see what the red error might happen to be. And we scroll down, it'll tell us what happened. We've got some things there that were okay. What was the error? Dump, dump, dump. Is no such file in this particular repository. That's not great. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to run this. We'll undo whatever changes are there. We're going to run this for Svelte because I have a feeling that there was a Vue change recently that didn't work for this. So how do I change this for Vue? That's a great question. So right here, the workflow file that I mentioned is locally too now on our app. We can change this to build our Svelte app by doing Svelte right there for the location and change this to public for the artifact. Then all I have to do is commit it, change to Svelte. To deploy anywhere, your code has to actually build, which in this case it didn't. And now we're pushing up Svelte. We'll go back to the actions. Now you can see that it's running for change to Svelte. And once that's done, this will be available at the URL shown right here, which is Orange Meadow for our application. So this is going to take about 1 minute and 20 seconds for it to run. It's about 16 seconds in. But let's go look at the final app to give you an idea of what you're going to get. You're going to get an app that looks just like this. We won't be able to log in yet because we haven't set that up. And we're not going to have a custom domain because we haven't set that up yet. But notice you get this SSL connection right here. So we've got shop at home once I set my custom domain up, and we've got our certificate automatically connected to that custom domain. So we'll get the certificate for the domain that got created, this Orange Meadow URL. So that gets set up for us. And all the sites here, this Orange Meadow, this is going to be globally distributed to multiple servers around the world. So no matter where you are, you can access this. All right, let's go back to our action. Here's change to Svelte. We'll go watch the process for build and deploy. And there's the build and deploy. It's running, and it's been about 1 minute, so it shouldn't take too much longer on this particular one. So we'll just watch through, and I'll show you as you run through. Now I'm running into another error. Let's go down to the bottom. We'll see what happens. We don't have TypeScript, so I'm curious why that was failing. Function Python is unsupported. Well, live demos, that's what you get. So we're just going to look at the running version of this, and I'm going to switch over to it. Why not? So on this application, instead of going to ATO 2020, we're going to look at the shop at home. And it says it's not available. There it is. Just had a refresh. And here's the application. And we can see the normal URL for the shop at home is not shopathome.dev, but it's commos, which will also work. But that's the same thing as shopathome.dev without the custom domain. We can see the GitHub action runs are over here. And you can see all the different runs that I've had. They usually take about 1 minute and 40 seconds. And then they get the green check mark when they build. And you can also see how the custom domains get set up. All you do is click on custom domains on the left. You click add, which I've already got one, so I'm not going to select it again. And then you type in your custom domain. Of course, you must own it, and you must point your DNS to your server, which in this case for shop at home was commos. So once you do that, you get your SSL, you get your custom domain, and everything's good to go. So let's go back to the slides here. So we showed how the app can work, and we had the live demo fail, so we're going to look at the final version of it. The next step we looked at is how do we get this other stuff? The global scale, that's what that second icon is. We automatically got global scale when we set things up. We didn't have to do anything. Did we get our custom domain? Yes, all we have to do is click on custom domain and type in a domain that we own and then connect DNS to it. Did we get our Azure functions? Not quite yet. I'll show you how you do that. And then do we get the routing between the cores, between the API and the static web app? Yes, that's automatic out of the box. And so is our CI/CD. Let's go take a look at those in this app. So how do we get the API to work? If we go back to our main app, which was shop at home, and open up GitHub. If we look at the actions page, there's a couple ways to get to the workflow file, but we can go from actions and look at the last one that ran. And here's the workflow. All we have to do is type in the name of the API location. Notice line 29, I'll make that bigger. Line 29 shows you the name of the folder that stores the API. As long as that's the name of the folder where your functions live, it's going to look for them there and deploy them. If it doesn't find them in that folder, it just won't bother. It won't fail. It just won't bother deploying functions because you didn't have any. So we just changed this workflow file, commit it, and that's how you get your functions to actually run up in the browser. And that's why when I'm logged in as Twitter, in this case, my Twitter ID, I can see my list, which is great. So I can go back from home and list, but I can't see discounts. Why? Because discounts, not only do I have to be authenticated, but I also have to be in an authorization role. And that's the next thing we're going to look at. So if we go back to the slides here, we've seen that we've done all 6 of these things so far. We've got our global scale and our SSL, and we've got our APIs. The next piece is how do we make sure that we get our authentication authorization setup, and then any custom routing that we want. So we'll take a look at how that works. So what I want to do is I want to set it up so that when I log in as Twitter, I can automatically get to just my list. Now I'm logged out, I can't get to anything. Now, the cool thing about this is to make that work, all you have to do is tell Static Web Apps which ones of these providers you want to support. It supports Twitter, GitHub, Azure Active Directory, Google, or Facebook now. And you can support all 5 if you like. Or in my application, what I'm going to show you is how you can turn off some of these. So let's go back into the code. And here is the final version of the app. In the Svelte application, there's a file that you can add to your app called routes.json. Now, this routes.json is a special file that you can customize your routing and your authentication and authorization. It goes in the public folder for a Svelte app. It goes wherever the files get deployed. So in Svelte, it's public. So we open up routes.json. This is a file I created for Static Web Apps. I decided that 5 options was too many for authentication for my application. So instead, I'm saying, you know what? I'm not going to support Facebook and Google. I'm going to support Twitter, GitHub, and Azure Active Directory. So what I do is I say, if you go to the route, that's login Facebook or auth login Google, return a 404. So let's go back to the app. Now, if I go into Google down here and I try to log in, notice it went to a 404 page. That's because I told it not to support that. Facebook, same thing. But if I go into Twitter, we saw earlier, it bounces me to the Twitter authentication page. It would have asked me to log in if I hadn't already, and then it would have bounced me back right here. So now I'm authenticated as Twitter, which is what I wanted to do. So you can turn off some of the authentication to do that. Now, how did I get the authentication to work? It's automatically built in. All you have to do, I'll log out again, is under Twitter. If I look at this one here and I inspect it, you can see it's just a link over in the code, but inside the application itself, we look for Twitter. What we're going to see is in my nav bar, I've got this array of strings, which lists all 5 of those inside my Svelte application. If I go look at what happens to them, I'm effectively passing them to this auth login component. So if we look at that component, it's effectively just creating a URL. It says go to .auth/login, name of provider. And that's it. This is called easy auth, and it automatically redirects you to one of these other authentication providers to set up your authentication, excuse me. So all 5 of those work out of the box. There's no setup at the portal. It's completely up to you. If you don't want to worry about disabling some of the providers like I did, like I got rid of Google and Facebook here, just because sometimes there's too many options. If you don't want to do that and you want to support all 5, you don't have to do any code changes. It all just works. So that's the authentication. But how do I make it so that when I log in and I authenticate, I can also set up a role? Like, let's say your app wants to support that people who are in a super user, a preferred account, maybe they pay for your services, they can see discounts from grocery stores. Well, I have to be able to separate authenticated users from those preferred ones. So what I want to do is I want to go back in my app, and you'll see here I've got some routes set up. And I set that here that if you go to the API discounts, I only want to allow the roles in this array. And there's a role I named called preferred. I could have called that role John Papa if I wanted to. You can call the role anything you like. So I'm saying that all these routes here only allow preferred to see the discounts. Or I happen to set up my editing of shopping lists. You can't edit your shopping list, which is API/X, any routes that go there, unless you're in the preferred role. But everything else, you just have to be authenticated and that's it. So where do these roles come from? For this, you do have to go back to the portal. And I believe we're open right there. Yep. So here's the portal. And over on the left, we already saw custom domains. If we go down to role management, we click on that, you'll notice I have an identity here called John Papa, one word, from the GitHub authentication provider. And I've given it the role preferred. I could invite somebody easily here and say, all right, which provider is it? Let's say that it's GitHub. And let's say that it's my daughter, Madeline Papa. I want her to have access to Shop at Home Dev. I want to give her the access to the preferred role. And I can use comma separated list here. And I'm going to create an invitation that expires in an hour. Now I generate this, and then I can copy this invitation link and I can send her a text message or an email or anything I want. Once she clicks on that, it'll ask her if she wants to join this. So once you do that, it will automatically add the role right here. Everybody gets anonymous and authenticated. So I only have to add the special roles like preferred. And once I do that, now you can see if I log in with GitHub, we should be able to do and see the discounts. So we go back to the Svelte app. I'd click on GitHub. It's going to authenticate with GitHub. Now when I come back in, I look at the list. There's my list, and there's my discounts. So now we've got authentication and authorization set up all in one place. And it's all controlled through this routes.json file, which is just an object where you can say, all right, this is the routes that I want to change the default behavior. In this case, I said discounts are preferred. So are anything that's like, for example, I want to go to my shopping list. If you're going to change that, let's say that this was an update or deletes or an insert or a post, post, put, deletes. That's what that's going to represent right there. And then down at the bottom, I've got a special route saying, because these are client-side routes, if anything hits the server and it's an unknown file, like it doesn't match one of the routes above and it's not index.html or some other file on the server, return index.html with status code 200. Why is this important? This is important because you might have a route in your application like /discounts right there. And when you click refresh, what's happening in client-side web frameworks like Svelte, React, Angular, Vue is that a lot of times that routing's handled in a client-side router in the browser. So when you hit refresh, it goes to the server first because it's got to load all the content. When it hits the server, or in this case, our CDN, the CDN says, I don't have anything called discounts in the server. So therefore, before it even loads the Svelte app, it would 404. So what we do to avoid that is we tell the server, hey, it's okay. Tell the client app to handle this. So we load the index.html, which is where our Svelte app is. And then when it comes back to the client, when I hit refresh, you'll notice it just loads the discounts. This is just the nature of web frameworks. So this is helping us work with these different modern frameworks that are up there. So let's go back to our slides here. So we've seen now how we set up the app, we published it, we looked at our API, and we set up our authorization and authentication and customized routes. And we got all of these things. And all we really had to do was write some code. Now, Azure Static Web Apps will do this for you. There's other products that'll do it too. But the cool thing here is we can do this on our own. Yes, I get asked a lot. So why would you bother with this? I can set up SSL. I can set up custom domains. I can set up a reverse proxy with cores. I can set up serverless functions. I can set up storage. I can get an SSL certificate. I can also set up my custom domain and connect everything together. I can also set up getting my apps out to global scale everywhere. But is it easy? Can you do it in one place? That's the big thing here. You might have to use 10 different services on a cloud provider to get it there. So that's where the shift is coming from. Modern web technology builds code into these web apps. And then we deploy these web apps. And these run in the browser. So basically what's happening is the cloud providers are all shifting to supporting these really popular web frameworks in a way that just makes it easy. And you don't need to be an architect with 20 years experience to be able to deploy things like reverse proxies. So we get a single unified workflow, in this case with GitHub Actions. We have optionally, if we have APIs, we can use serverless functions to do that with Azure Functions. And we get integrated authentication and authorization with roles if we want to do that. Now, if you want to try this yourself, we're having a workshop right at the next hour where myself and Burke Holland and Craig Shoemaker are going to be here to walk through a step-by-step with a hands-on tutorial. Well, you'll be able to go with us step-by-step through this and then ask us questions in the chat and we'll respond and help you get through any build issues that we might have had, like I had. And we'll get you through those so you can deploy your first one. Now, don't worry, because if you use Vue or Svelte or React or Angular, we've got a version of that for all of you. We're going to follow this resource here called Learn. It's a Learn module, which is basically a hands-on tutorial that we're going to use. And you can do this on your own, and it's 100% free. If you want to look up the documentation, there's this great docs site that we've set up as well, which has got 20 pages of docs on how to do everything I just showed you and more. And if one of your frameworks isn't one of these four, don't worry about it. I set up a website here at GitHub called Hello Worlds, where there's over 30 web frameworks with a Hello World version of them. And you can point to that repo. And I set it up as a template repo, so you can make your own template, point to that repo and choose whatever web framework you want and deploy it to Azure Static Web Apps. Because maybe you're not using one of these. Maybe you're using Ember or Backbone or jQuery or just plain old JavaScript. We've got an option for you. So give it a shot and see what you think. And I would love for you all to stick around for the workshop at the top of the hour. In the meantime, we've got about 5 minutes for questions. So I will stop screen sharing and take any questions that you have. Just type them into the chat. Okay, cool. So a couple questions here. I see Stathis asking, thanks. Some of us need slower steps. Yep, I do too. And the next step is our company to take this will be to go through it. So I would recommend you stick around for the next session, which is a workshop, which goes much slower. We don't do everything I just showed you, but we're going to get you deployed. And also we'll look at the resources that I pointed out for those URLs, so you can actually try this yourself later if you want to. Is that a Taylor? Yes, it's a Taylor guitar in the background, a 314E. Thank you very much. Although I don't play it as much as I'd like to. Can I share the links in the chat? Absolutely. Let me paste those in there. I'll put the Learn module is here.
I just wanted to tell you have 3 minutes left, Mr. Papa. So just go ahead and begin wrapping up. Thank you.
Thank you. So I put the Learn module, the docs, and also the Hello Worlds repo. I'll put that into the chat as well. I'll also show these in the workshop, which is coming up next. Peter DeVito's asking, and I knew I was going to get this. So thanks for asking. Is the Blazor included in the included frameworks? Yes. You can also deploy Blazor WebAssembly, basically up to Azure Static Web Apps. So you can check that out. Any idea when Azure Static Web Apps will be out of preview? From Katie. Thanks for asking, Katie. I don't know at this point. Preview is effectively like, a beta release candidate kind of thing. It's our time to make sure we're getting the right features in. For example, when it was released in preview in May of this year, we didn't support Blazor quite yet officially. We just released the Blazor support last month in September, so that's now out. And there's other features that we're rounding out. So when it is ready, you'll know, and I will be announcing that with everybody else at Microsoft on Twitter and blog posts as soon as it is. Let's see here. Do I need to create an account somewhere to deploy the static web app or just the extension? Great question, Simone. So you do need an Azure account, but the good news is if you go through the Learn module that we're going to have in the workshop next, we have what you call Sandbox. You basically get a free account for 4 hours to do whatever you want. So we'll do that in the workshop, and the workshop only takes 45 minutes. If you don't have an Azure account and you want one, there's also a free Azure account that you can get. If you Google free Azure, you'll find the link quickly. I believe that if you go to azure.com/try, you also get a free trial there too. So yes, you can do that. Let's see here. We got about a minute left. Will we have the material on demand? Yes, absolutely. They'll have the videos and you'll also have the resources. And for those of you saying go slow, that's why we did a session first and we're going to have a workshop second, because the workshop, we're going to go much slower and step by step. So we will see you all at the workshop in about 15 minutes at the top of the hour, 2:00 p.m. Eastern time zone, if that's your time zone, and I believe 11 a.m. Pacific. Thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your time.